Okay, welcome to the second lecture. And we're talking about the early Renaissance. And we'll be talking about Michelangelo in this painting a little bit later, a few lectures on. So to set the stage, we're going to be talking about the early Renaissance in Italy. Most people believe it starts there, but there's also a good argument to be made that it started in the Netherlands as well. But for the purpose of this class, we'll just do Italy. So about 1400 for sculpture is when it starts in architecture. About 1350 for painting, if you consider Giotto to be the start, who we talked about last lecture, or 1420 if you're talking about Florence and Museo. In many ways, Florence and Museo is a little more solid as far as what we're doing. So what's interesting is something that we are going to see later in the class, but if you had taken my Art 121 class, the ancient, the medieval, you wouldn't have noticed this. This is the first self-aware era. And by that, I mean they were aware while they were in it that this was something new, that they were literally a part of a new era. And most people before that wouldn't think that. They would just think, this is modern times. So they kind of looked back and placed themselves in the context of history. They looked at the medieval times and they associated it with darkness and the transcendent. And I would say associating with darkness is not very fair. If you take my Art 121 class, you'll see lots of beautiful things with lots of light. But transcendent, that is fair. A lot of the art and architecture was made towards having a more spiritual focus. Whereas with the Renaissance, in some ways, they saw themselves as having more of a down-to-earth focus. It's, of course, more complicated than that, but again, for the purposes of this class, that's good enough. So Renaissance, or Renaissance, if you want to say it with a French accent, is French for rebirth. And what they're talking about is a rebirth of the classical. So what they did is they looked back at the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, and they took what they thought was the best, and they wanted to progress forward from that and do it in both a Christian and a humanistic context. So humanistic is this belief, the best way to define it, is this belief that human beings can perfect themselves. And you could never reach that perfection, but it's something that you can work towards. So you could probably say that it starts in literature much earlier, and that's usually the case. If you think of literature or philosophy, it takes a lot less effort to think of something and write it down than it does to, say, make new art mediums or make architecture or something like that. So Petrarch in the 14th century started with a revival of the classics, reading the ancient Greeks, reading the ancient Romans, many of which were coming through Arab sources. So their idea was to surpass the ancients. And looking back, a lot of people, as far as like Western historians, look at this as the birth of the modern era. But even if you were looking from outside of the West, you could see it as that way as well because of the effects of European imperialism on the rest of the world, which begins during this time period as well. So setting the stage in Florence, they had defended against the Visconti, who dies in 1402 in Milan. And their idea was that they won the battles against the Visconti, and it was a trade war, because they had greater military might, greater diplomatic might, and greater intellectual backing to what they were doing. So they say, we're a republic, the Visconti is a monarchy, so we're better. The reality is they were probably just lucky that Visconti died and then the army came home. But like Athens, they kind of looked at this and said, yeah, this is a justification. This means that what we're doing is the right thing. So they took this pride into works of art. And of course, it's wealthy people that are patronizing this art. They built the baptistry, the Duomo, which is just the Italian word for a big old cathedral. And during this time, the visual arts considered to be no longer a craft and started to be part of the liberal arts. So the liberal arts developed in medieval times, and again, actually based on Arab sources, the idea of what education should be. And it was things like theology, music, history, mathematics, and then philosophy. And philosophy included what we would call science nowadays. But the visual arts weren't part of it. Music was. So during this time, the visual arts came to be considered part of the liberal arts. In other words, an intellectual pursuit, not just a craft. I'm not saying that's true because it wasn't. Before that, it was an intellectual pursuit. But this was something that happened in art education and people believed at the time. So it helps us understand what's going on. They were viewed as people of ideas rather than mere manipulators of materials. So for good or ill, this concept of artistic genius starts to develop during this time. And I think you'll see when I'm talking about as far as ill, when I talk about some of the awful personalities of some of the artists later on. So the patronage is pretty typical for any other time period. In this way, the Renaissance is no different than anyone else. Rich merchants and bankers, the Medici, if you're in Italy, pronounce it Medici. The Medici family was a family of bankers. And even though Florence is a republic, which is the same type of government that they have in the United States, like the US Republic, tend to be dominated by the wealthy. So that was the case in Florence. But they did do some things that led towards the art that we're talking about. So Giovanni established the family fortune. That was the businessman. Cosimo, he was more interested in the arts. Think of like modern day philanthropists or something like that. He was a humanist, and he did do one thing that's like better than what philanthropists usually do. He founded the first public library since the ancient world in the West. Again, in the Arab world, there were lots of those. So Lorenzo, who was a poet, and he founded an academy for artists. So you can kind of see a pretty standard progression of generations. You have the first generation, that's all business. Second generation, it's kind of in two worlds. And the third generation, all artists. So Lorenzo, in some ways, is going to be the most interesting and have the biggest effect on the arts as far as the philosophy behind it. But the other two are giving up money for it. So to get an idea on what's changed, it's good to look at sculptures. And this was part of the discussion assignment we had online. So if you did this, fine. If you haven't done it, or if you answered the other question I put up there, then go back and see what answers people had. And you can get an idea on some of the things that have changed. I mean, just to list a few things, you can kind of see how these figures are a little bit more down to earth, their interaction with each other. And by down to earth, I mean they're literally like standing on ground here all together, where these ones are standing on pedestals. And they're very naturalistic. In other words, they feel like real people. These ones are pretty natural, but some of them not so natural. And they also don't really stand in a natural way. They seem to be posing, whereas these figures seem to be interacting as if we are among them. So there's other differences, but again, look at the discussion board and you can get an idea what's going on with that. So early Italian Renaissance and sculpture, and it starts in sculpture first, which is a little bit odd if you think about it, because sculpture is a lot more expensive than painting. So this particular one by Nanni di Banco, Four Saints, that's just what Quattro Coronati means. They were executed for not carving a statue for Diocletian. Diocletian was one of the Roman emperors that was particularly fond of persecuting Christians, executing them. So there's many stories of saints who were executed. Saint Sebastian is a good example by Diocletian. And these types of figures of saints from the early church when it was still underground are pretty common even before this era. So Florence was attacked by King Ladislas of Naples. Naples was another monarchy, and remember, Florence isn't. So this could be another scene where the Florentines can see themselves and the types of sacrifices that these Quattro Coronati made. So the idea is the reason why they wouldn't make these statues for Diocletian is because they had converted to Christianity, and it was against their religion to make images of other gods. So Diocletian asked them to do that. They wouldn't do it, and they were executed. So kind of standing up for your beliefs to the point of giving up your life, again, is something that the Florentines will relate to and kind of see themselves, their republic, their form of government, as being superior. So this was in the Golden Legend, and the Golden Legend includes a lot of stories. The best way I can describe it is it has lots of wizards and dragon type stories, but it also has, imagine if there's a lot of holes, I guess you could say, in the Bible, in the New Testament, where there's parts of the story that don't seem to be there that you would like. So Golden Legend fills in some of those, and also in early Christianity. So according to Golden Legend, which again, there's probably some truth, but maybe not, was placed alive in lead coffins and thrown into the sea. So Diocletian was definitely motivated to execute these guys. So to relate it to modern times, what the Florentines might have been seeing is Rome and the Papal States were overrun by King Ladislas. Florence stands firm to a siege, and Ladislas dies in 1414. Again, they got kind of lucky with this one. They gave up the siege after that. So a siege is one of the most brutal forms of warfare. If you're not familiar, basically surround a city, and the idea is to starve them into surrender. And since they were able to resist this, it again has this relationship with the Quattro Coronati, with these four saints. So again, look at the discussion board, and you kind of see what's changing here. And I'm interested to see what students have said so far. At the bottom, you can see something that's pretty typical. A lot of sculptures, ones that are outside of churches, are patronized by different trade groups or guilds, as they were called at the time. So this one is patronized by the Sculptors Guild. So underneath the sculpture, they have a picture of a sculpture of the sculptors to show that they paid for it. And this is pretty common. This is basically, we did this, we made this happen. So this is not some awful human being about to hit a giant baby in the head. Instead, this is a sculptor who's working on a sculpture of a baby. So this one, we're getting a lot closer to what we're going to see in the rest of the Renaissance, except that he's wearing clothes. And this is Donatello's St. George, another of those early Christian saints that has a lot of legendary stories associated with it, stories that are actually popular in other parts of the world as well. He was apprentice to Ghiberti that we saw in the first lecture. And what makes this one kind of stand out is the other sculptures we looked at, including the four saints, had been part of the building. Like, you couldn't really take them out of the building and have them exist on their own. This one is placed in a building, but you could take him out and be able to walk around him, and he would still make sense. So in this case, he's fully autonomous. And this is kind of new for the Renaissance and more like what the ancient Greeks and Romans had done. This particular one was commissioned by the Swordsmakers Guild, and they used to have a great sword in here, but that's missing nowadays because it was an actual sword. Somebody probably found it more useful. And the story of St. George is also from the Golden Legend. And it's another one of those kind of, you win through the grace of God or through your superior intellectual might. In the case of St. George, he was traveling, and he traveled to this town that's sometimes considered to be in Libya in Africa. And they had a town that was around an oasis, which is really good to have in Libya, which is a lot of desert, except in the north. And there was a dragon who was poisoning the water supply, or threatened to poison the water supply if the town didn't give him, I think it was like 7 young women or 7 virgins and 7 young men, something along those lines, to sacrifice. And they felt like they were helpless. So George came in, he assessed their problem and took his sword and killed the dragon with it. And this is kind of similar to another story we're going to see in a moment. About David and Goliath. So the Florentines were really fond of these David and Goliath type stories. In other words, this smaller person or human being, in the case of St. George, defeating this giant enemy that seems impossible to defeat, which they are. So the belief it is in these stories that it's through the grace of God that they're able to defeat these larger enemies. The Florentines kind of saw that as it's through the grace of their superior government, philosophies, intellectual achievement. So kind of relating it both to Christianity and to the way that the ancient Greeks, like the Athenians, saw themselves. So this one, we can see a lot of things that we'll see a little bit later on. There's a little bit of what's called contrapposto, where you bend one knee and then straighten the other one, and that moves all the parts of the body in concert. You can kind of see how his head is turned this way, his shoulders the other way, and we keep seeing those contrasts throughout the body. One arm bent, one arm straight, and there's just kind of like some parts are turned to the right, some to the left, and there's this balance throughout. So this type of thing was really popular with the ancient Greeks. And if this sculpture was made out of bronze, it would make it so that it could stand on its own. But we will see Donatello does work in bronze. When you see his face, it's kind of interesting. He originally wore a helmet, but I think when I show this to a lot of students, they perceive his face as being somewhat worried or concerned. You can see his brow is furrowed, his eyes are pretty open, his mouth is somewhat pursed, and people will read this as concern or worry. I think if you see him from other angles, he may seem more confident. So that's one of the interesting things that's about sculpture that's in the round, meaning ones that you can walk all the way around. They seem to become different works of art depending on where you're at. Obviously, the kind of bad shape of this particular sculpture makes it look not quite as good as it would in previous times. You can see it's a quite bigger in life size, unless St. George was on his way to the NBA. It's about 6 feet 10 inches tall. And when you see it from this side, he looks really concerned, doesn't he, with that furrowed brow and his eyes looking upwards. So that's kind of interesting. It's getting us in the story. He's not just a hero. He's a hero that is actually kind of afraid, which would make sense if you're about to slay a dragon, or not sure if you can do it. When you look at the hands, we can see like that kind of tenseness in the fist, but also this would have been to hold the sword originally. Below it, they tell the part of the story. This is one of those virgins about to be sacrificed. And it was commissioned about 2 years later, the part on the bottom. And it shows George slaying the dragon. The dragon's looking pretty small in this one. And what's being shown here is this Italian concept of schiacciato, which means flattened out. And it's a way of showing a three-dimensional space on a carving that's not in the round. So in other words, one you can't walk all the way around. So what he does is he flattens it out, schiacciato, the background, and that makes it look like it's farther in the background. And then things that are closer to us, they stick out a little bit. So that's used later in the Renaissance as well to give this appearance of 3 dimensions. So these two are a good idea to compare. Again, this would be one of those things where you could go to the discussion board because it's one of the options. And if you hadn't answered it, just see what other people said. I think I would say that the first thing that people notice is that David on the left is in the nude and the angel Gabriel on the right is not. And that is a big difference because after that Ghiberti that we saw in the last one, this is the first full-sized nude since ancient Rome. And that's kind of a big deal. And I'll explain that in a moment. Other things people see is there's some similarities in there's quite a feminine type of air to both figures. There's very like kind of thin and graceful look and a lot of like relaxation and almost in this one, David had just killed Goliath, but he looks pretty satisfied about it. And you can see a similar facial expression on this. There's also some contrapposto here. In other words, Gabriel's hip is canted this way, one knee is bent, but it's kind of extreme and not quite as realistic as what we see with David, where we can see everything that's going underneath his body. So we're not just seeing a surface. We're seeing a human as if he was a real human with a skeleton and muscles on the inside of him. So this is the early Renaissance, and that's the High Gothic, the previous period that lasted through the 14th century. So this one, Donatello's David, it's the first freestanding life-size nude since Roman times. And it was made to celebrate the victory against Milan. Milan was a much larger and much wealthier monarchy, and the Florentines saw themselves as similar to David in killing the giant Goliath. So just to briefly tell you the story, so you can get an idea of what's going on if you're not familiar with it. David is a figure from the Old Testament in the Bible, and he would eventually become a king and a great hero himself. But at first, he was a young man, and he actually was able to play the lute really well. And the king at that time, Saul, used to have these horrible headaches, and he heard about this kid that played a great lute, and it turned out that it made his headaches go away. So he got kind of close to the king at that time. And then what was going on outside of there is there was a grand army, and they were about to invade and take over the Hebrews. And the Hebrews were really upset about this. One of the great warriors of the invading enemies, Goliath, who was supposed to be this giant, perhaps like 7 feet tall, perhaps even larger, and super muscular and scary, and with the heads of enemies everywhere. He goes up to the Hebrews and he says, "If anyone can fight me one-on-one in a battle, then we will retreat and leave you all alone." So everyone's like, "Yeah, I don't want to do that." But David says, "Hey, I'll do it." And everyone's like, "What are you doing, dude? You're like 14 years old. You're going to get yourself killed." But everyone's like, "Okay, if the kid wants to do it, he can do it." So they're like, "Well, let's at least give him a fighting chance." And some of the people around the king, they try to give him some armor. And David's like, "Oh, this is too heavy. I can't deal with this." They try to give him some weapons, and he's like, "No, I can't use those. I'll just use my sling." So literally the Bart Simpson weapon, a sling with a rock in it. So the battle is there. And Goliath comes up and he's stomping in, he's wearing all this armor, and he's got this giant sword. He's scary as hell, and he's like, "Who is coming to defeat me?" And he sees little David wearing his regular clothes, doesn't even see the sling, and he's just like, "Yeah, okay, this is going to be pretty short. I might actually feel bad about this." So David, without even thinking about it, without a pause, he puts a stone, a relatively small one, into his sling, and whips it at Goliath, hits him in the middle of the forehead, and kills him instantly. Then he takes Goliath's sword and uses it to behead him so he can take it back to the Hebrews. So the kind of point of this story, or the lesson of this story, isn't that David was extremely lucky, or don't mess with teenagers. The lesson is that, yes, he was really small and he had no chance, but through the grace of God, and in this case, supporting the ancient Hebrews, he was able to defeat this enemy. So the Florentines see themselves as the same way. Milan is Goliath. They're David. And then sure, through the grace of God, but also through their superior intellectual government, everything that they do. So they like this one. So some other things you may notice when you're seeing this one is that it's rather homoerotic. And people had noticed it at the time. And Donatello surely intended this. And it was just, it wasn't, you couldn't really be super out in the open in many parts of Italy at this time about being gay. But unless you had enemies that wanted to take you down, you could live this way relatively safely. But the sculpture was originally done to stand outside. And when people saw it, some people made a fuss about it. They noticed the homoeroticism in it. So it was eventually moved indoors. But this is going to be pretty common. Most of the artists we're going to look at in the Renaissance are gay men, or that's how they would be defined in modern times. So this isn't particularly unusual. Seeing it from the back as well. Again, he shows him as a young man, which is pretty accurate. We're going to see Michelangelo later on, he's going to be showing him as a larger and older man. So when you see him here, he's wearing that hat. So even though he's nude, he's definitely got a little bit of style going on. And he doesn't look particularly concerned, but his lowered eye shows humility. Remember, this isn't him or luck that enabled him to do this. This is through the grace of God. So he's showing that he's humble, and God giving him this gift of being able to defeat this enemy for the ancient Hebrews. And then Goliath is shown as the wind god. And this is like pretty similar to what we're going to see later on. A lot of Christian stories and Christian figures are mixed together or portrayed as figures from ancient Greek mythology. So Zephyr, who killed Hyacinth, it's again kind of showing this same idea. So he's portrayed in that way, like the ancient Greeks would do it. So this one, we saw the Ghiberti one on the right, the sacrifice of Isaac. And you remember that story, another story that's kind of about submitting to God and being humble to God. In this one, the sacrifice of Isaac, that we already saw that there were some Gothic type elements in it, and some Renaissance type elements, especially the nude, which is, if you remember, heroic. And that comes from ancient Greece, where they saw the athletes as a symbol of heroism, and it became separate from athletics, a symbol of human perfection. So in this case, that type of human perfection is heroism, is in the sacrifice of Isaac. You can see how the one on the left has developed to something that's more what we're going to see throughout the Renaissance in painting. There is perspective, and I'm going to include a video on this lecture and the next lecture, just so you can get it twice, explaining Brunelleschi and how he developed scientific perspective. So check out that video, and it'll show you some of the elements that enable this to look really three-dimensional. Some of them we've seen in Giotto, where you kind of minimize the ground plane. But the other one, as far as using linear perspective, which the video will explain, but the basic idea is you have these lines that kind of converge into the background. And then using foreshortening, that means like all these squares are the same size, but they seem to get smaller and smaller in the background. Put some of these things together and you have the effect of 3 dimensions. And with Brunelleschi, it's scientific and mathematical. So we'll see later when we look at Museo and painting that you can take a painting like the one we're going to look at, or a sculpture like the one we're looking at here, and you can map it into 3 dimensions. As if it was a real space. So this is a very different way of doing perspective than ancient Romans. And this story, the story of Jacob and Esau, panel of the Gates of Paradise, he gets to have 2 doors. So he won a competition for the doors on one side of the Duomo, and then on one side of the baptistry, and he wins another one with this one. So he gets to decorate a couple of doors in some beautiful ways. So we can see how he populates the area with figures. He's using these like flattened spaces as it goes in the background. It gets more and more flat. Then also the new kind of perspective that everyone was trying to do. So it has a really good illusion of space that you don't really see here. When we get in a little closer, he's doing a thing that's kind of like the Gothic in that he's telling different parts of the story. And in this one, we see, actually, I don't have to tell the whole story. It would take a lot longer than is necessary. You can read the story, but there's basically one part here, there's one part in the background, and another part here, but it's all in the same frame. So you think of these happening in different times. Eventually, later in the Renaissance, artists will stop doing that, and they'll make a whole different painting if they want to have a different, or a whole different panel if they want to have a different story. So the grandeur of the architecture reflects the dignity of the event shown in the foreground. So what Alberti is talking about here, and Alberti is writing in the 16th century, so 100 years after this, is the way that this architecture looks like ancient Roman architecture. And we're going to see this throughout the class. Ancient Roman architecture basically becomes a shorthand for this is important, because the story of Jacob and Esau, if they were historical figures, would have existed 1,000 years before the time of the ancient Romans. So including this is not accurate to the time, which they're not really concerned with. Instead, it's just showing this is an important event. So this last one we're looking at reflects a couple of things. One thing that is really revolutionary in a way, and another way in that it's changing what's happening in the art. And this really shows you how, like often in modern times, they talk about the economy and how it affects people. That was the case back in the day as well. And also power struggles will affect people, including artists. So this is Antonio del Pollaiuolo, which is a hard word to say, even in Italian. So by 1450, public funding ends. So the Medicis are kind of losing their fortunes, and they're not spending a lot of money on expensive art. So instead, you do a lot of private commissions for the many wealthy people that are in Florence and other places in Italy. So people kind of revive, and I'm talking about people with money, revive this ancient hobby, I guess you could say, of sculpture collecting. And these ones are small enough that they can sit on a desk. It's made out of bronze, like the Donatello we saw before, but still that way. So Pollaiuolo was most likely trained by Ghiberti, so we looked at earlier. He was also a painter who was really fond of this particular theme, which is Hercules and Antaeus. These two are kind of like semi-god-like figures. Antaeus is like a titan, and he starts to fight Hercules, and Antaeus gets his power from the ground. So every time Hercules would knock him over, and he seems like he was going to win the fight, then Antaeus would get all his power right back. So finally, Hercules figured out, hey, I'll just hold him up off the ground, and then he won't be able to get his power back. And that's how it worked. And he was able to defeat him. So what's unusual about this one is we have two figures, and they're cast in the same bronze, and they're together. And there isn't really a precedent, ancient or medieval, for doing this theme in this way, or even doing connected sculptures. Sometimes the ancient Greeks had done separate sculptures and put them near each other. But this is a new thing, and it's going to become really popular even long after the Renaissance. There'll be artists that are still doing this in modern times. So this last one kind of shows how the artists, at first they want to kind of look to ancient Rome and ancient Greece. They want to make things look really real, natural, like the ancients. But eventually they move forward and start to do things that are more interesting or even expressive. So this is Andrea del Verrocchio. Sorry about the pronunciation. Verrocchio. And he was one of the few teachers of Leonardo da Vinci, who we'll look at later on. And I'll mention this again when we talk about Leonardo. Art historians don't call him Da Vinci. They call him Leonardo. Calling him Da Vinci would, like, if people called me Russell from Detroit, it would be like just calling me Detroit. Like, there's a bunch of people that are from Detroit. So we call him Leonardo. But this picture, again, it's showing like an interesting kind of struggle that is really important for a lot of Christians, certainly Catholics. And that's the idea of the struggle of faith. So they tell this through the story of the doubting of Thomas, which is a story from the gospel after Jesus had been executed and then resurrected. And what happens here is Jesus, according to the gospel, dies. He's executed by crucifixion. And then he's dead for 3 days, and he rises and comes back to life. And this becomes more and more important to Christians later on than it was in previous times. And when he's resurrected, he doesn't just like go out into the street and say, hey, I'm back. It's pretty cool, right? He doesn't. Instead, he just kind of appears to people randomly. And one of those times that he appeared to all his former closest followers that Christians call the apostles. And they saw him and they're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. This dude is dead. Now he's alive. Like, I'm kind of motivated now. So the problem is that Thomas, one of the apostles, wasn't there. So later on, the apostles get together with Thomas and they're like, you'll never guess who we saw. JC, Jesus Christ, he was alive. And Thomas is like, you are seeing things like people can't come back to life. which is a totally understandable thing to say because people don't come back to life. And Thomas says, not until I can stick my fingers in the wounds in his hands and stick my hand in the wound in his side that I will believe that Christ is risen, or that our rabbi, Jesus, has risen. So Jesus probably heard about this through the grapevine. He comes back and he goes up to Thomas and he says, here, Thomas, put your finger in my wounds in my hands, put your hand in the wound in my side. And that's exactly what we're seeing Jesus do here. And we're seeing the wound is kind of open and Thomas about to place his hand in there. We can see like a lot of the naturalism they would see in previously, aside from Jesus doesn't look particularly Palestinian, and neither does Thomas, but setting that aside for a moment, Europeans love to make everyone look like themselves. There is a lot of realism. These look like real people that could exist in the world. But there is like some interesting things that are going on that aren't particularly realistic, like these incredible folds with all of these kind of sharp lines. That's not really the way something could look. So many people had speculated kind of it represents through this kind of disorganization, the struggle of Christians to have faith. So to be a Christian, they have to believe things that they can't see, and also that don't seem like they're possible. Miraculous things like people raising from the dead, or gods up in heaven and rising up to heaven and living forever. Miracles, all these sorts of things. So Christians believe that this struggle is part of becoming a Christian. You take the irrational things that don't seem possible, the miracles, and you struggle with faith, meaning believing in these things. So this is a pretty common theme for Christians. When you get in close, you can see Jesus is like, yep, put your hand right in there. So the deep folds echoing the contrasting state of mind, the struggle to believe in unbelievable things. And that we don't have to do for this class. That's the end of this lecture.